This morning's gospel reading is a well-known story, isn't it, about Jesus' healing of 10 lepers, but only one of them comes back to say thank you. It's quite a short account in Luke, but there's so much that we can take from these 9 verses. It's in part a story about the marginalised, but it's also a story about a miracle and about our response to Jesus, a story about having faith, and also a story about gratitude. So quite a lot to get our teeth into this morning. Let's start by putting the story into context. The passage starts with the fact that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. So Luke has already told us earlier on in the Gospel that as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. I think the word resolutely is interesting. The Old Testament prophets often use this phrase quite a lot, and it could be translated as set his face. So there's something about Jesus journeying with his eyes set on the cross, looming in the distance. Jesus is on his way to his death, and Luke reminds us periodically that this is the journey that Jesus is on. So Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. We then read that he's travelling along the border between Samaria and Galilee. The location here is actually important because Jesus would have been near to both the Jews in Galilee and the Samaritans in Samaria. And it would also explain why later on in the story we hear that the 10 lepers included both Jews and Samaritans. This is interesting because the Jews really didn't like the Samaritans. This dislike went back years to when the Gentiles living in Samaria intermarried with the Samaritans. So the Jews would have seen Samaritans as religious half-breeds. They were not pure Jews, and therefore they were treated in an inferior way. So that's the context. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, on the border of Samaria and Galilee. And then we get to the interesting part. We read that as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance. Now we've all heard of leprosy, but it's worth saying that this was a truly devastating illness for many reasons. Firstly, it was the local priest who had the responsibility for diagnosing leprosy. He was the kind of health official of the day, as well as being the priest. And a diagnosis was really a death sentence. People were isolated from others, they were sent to live outside of their village, away from their families and friends. They had to shout, "Unclean, unclean," if anyone approached them. And leprosy was also regarded at that time as a sign of God's judgment. So often they viewed the person with leprosy as having brought suffering upon themselves. So it really was the worst disease of their day, bringing the physical pain of the skin condition, but also the emotional pain of being separated from all they love. Lepers tended, therefore, to roam together, looking for food, begging from a distance, and naturally ended up living together in what we would call leper colonies. And here they had the double insult of being with other lepers who were Jews or Samaritans, 2 groups of people who did not usually have much time for each other. So here we have 10 lepers standing at a distance, which was the law, and then we hear, "And they called out in a loud voice, 'Jesus, Master, have pity on us.'" Now, as a speech therapist, I'm interested in this bit because as leprosy often affected the vocal cords, so they may well have had raspy, low voices, and shouting would have actually been really difficult. But they did. They shouted out and they called Jesus by name, so we assume they'd heard of him. And they called him Master, so they understood him to have authority. And they asked him to have pity on them, which was surely a plea for healing. And then we read, "When he saw them," It's easy to skip over those 4 words and move on to what then Jesus says to them, but there's something powerful here in those words. These are people who are not supposed to be seen. They're living on the outside, but Jesus saw them. And there's something powerful about being seen, isn't there? Especially if you're suffering, if you're marginalised, and where society wants you to be unseen. So it's much easier to ignore the sick, the dying, the suffering, because maybe it makes us feel uncomfortable. We see the pain and we find it hard. So there's something here in the way that Jesus sees them. He sees their suffering and he acts, and he says, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." So just as the priests had the job of diagnosing leprosy, they also had to inspect anyone who believed they were healed. So Jesus tells them very practically to go to the priest, who will then be able to declare them healed and will have the power to restore them to a normal life. So Jesus didn't heal them immediately when they called out to him. Instead, he gives them a command that would test their faith in him. So we presume that they turned and headed towards the local priest, probably wondering what was going to happen. I imagine them looking down at their bodies and at each other and looking for signs that their limbs, their skin was being healed. And then, of course, we read, "And as they went, they were cleansed." So at some point on their journey to the priest, I imagine they would have looked down and seen that they were indeed healed. We don't know how long it took. Maybe they were healed in 5 minutes, or did it take an hour or 2? We don't know, but they had to start walking away in faith before their circumstances changed one tiny bit. And then the story goes on. One of them, when he saw that he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. Now, I'm sure the other 9 lepers were thankful. What had happened was truly life-changing for them. I imagine them rushing to the priest in their joys that they could be reunited with their families. Their desire to return to their normal life must have been overwhelming. But one of them turns back. He doesn't immediately rush to the priest. He takes the time to go back to Jesus to thank him. He falls at Jesus' feet, praising God. And in this act, we see him recognizing Jesus as the man who is also God. And by worshipping him and treating him as such, and we see him as expressing his understanding that this is God. And by worshipping him, we see him demonstrating his relationship with Jesus, who is also God. And then, of course, another important few words, and he was a Samaritan. Luke saves this surprise until late in the story. The one leper who models what faith should look like turns out to be the ultimate outsider of the day, a Samaritan. And Luke himself was a Gentile, a foreigner, so he probably delights in telling us how Jesus blesses foreigners, even Samaritans. And finally, the passage ends with Jesus asking, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go, your faith has made you well." Jesus is asking a few rhetorical questions here, but he is drawing attention to the 9 who did not come back to give thanks, and the foreigner, the one with the outsider status, who did. And he says that it is his faith that has made him well. So this is an interesting change in language. Well is a different word to healed and cleansed, which are both used earlier in the passage. This word well comes from the Greek word sozo, which means saved. So Jesus is saying to this very thankful man who wants to worship God before he returned home that his faith has saved him. He is not only physically healed, but is also saved spiritually. So what does this story mean to us today? What can we learn from this? Well, as I said at the beginning, I think it's a story about Jesus' care for the marginalised, and also about how we respond to Jesus with faith and with gratitude. As I said earlier, lepers were outsiders, and Samaritans were also seen as hugely inferior by the Jews. So a Samaritan leper definitely is doubly marginalised. But Jesus was all about the marginalised. In Luke chapter 4, he tells us that Jesus uses his inaugural sermon in the synagogue in Nazareth to quote from Isaiah, saying, "He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free." Jesus uses his inaugural speech to make his intentions clear. His attention is not on the religious leaders of the day, the important people, the respected people. His attention, right from the beginning, is on the marginalised, the outsiders. And this is evident right from the start. He is all about the people in our society who are unseen, suffering, uncomfortable to be around. So is there something we can take from this today? What is Jesus asking us to do here, now? Who are the people who live on the margins of our community? Who are those people who are treated as invisible or unlovely because of who they are, or how they look, or where they come from? Is there more we could do to see them, to journey with them a little, to offer comfort or hope? Or maybe there's a part of us that is hidden, a part of us that we don't like other people to see, or a part of us that is crying out to be seen. Jesus is not afraid of seeing the messy parts of us. He doesn't mind meeting us in those dark places. And maybe by inviting Jesus into those parts of ourselves, by meeting him there and recognising the fact that he loves us and he sees us, messy parts and all, that we will find a new outpouring of love for him that will make us well. And what does this passage tell us about faith? Well, Jesus tells the lepers to go and show themselves to the priests. Now, we don't know if they immediately turned and went, that they immediately had faith that Jesus knew what he was doing. Maybe they hesitated. Maybe they argued before they turned. But it was faith that made them ultimately start journeying towards the priest. And at some point on that journey, they were healed. But in order for that miracle to happen, these men had to start walking in faith before their circumstances changed. And Jesus wants us to do the same. We can't wait until our problems are over to start walking in faith. God asks for faith from us before anything at all maybe has changed. We need to trust him and to have faith. And part of having faith is sometimes to start the journey, to step out in faith along a path, trusting that he has us in the palm of his hand, that he goes before us and is with us. And finally, what does this story tell us about gratitude? Well, in the beginning of the story, we see 10 lepers who obviously had enough faith to call out to Jesus, "Jesus, Master," and for him to have mercy on them. But only one leper who said thank you. So while 10 prayed and called out to Jesus, only one praised him. And that can be so true of everyday life. We're hurting, we're suffering, we're finding life hard, and we cry out to God and pray our little hearts away. But as soon as blessings abound, we're off skipping down the road, checking in with our friends, off for a curry, and we forget to fall at Jesus' feet in adoration and praise. And of course, this is also a story about a miracle. And I wonder what you feel about miracles. Do you believe in them? Do you think they still happen? And what would you say was a miracle as opposed to just good luck? I don't expect many of us have got examples as dramatic as leprosy being cured, but I imagine a lot of us have got stories to tell that are easier to explain with a belief in God. Could I say that the changes I've seen in one of my sons is a miracle? And that the relationship that we now have is nothing short of miraculous? What about the girl I prayed for, who then got pregnant? Or my daughter-in-law, who is pregnant and was bleeding and it then stopped? Or the words of comfort that came to me when I was in the depths of depression, grieving for my mum? Would any of those be called a miracle? Of course, people who do not have a faith in God would say no, but maybe they are. Just maybe my life is full of lots of little miracles. Albert Einstein famously said there are only two ways to live your life. One is though nothing is a miracle, the other is as though everything is. And I do actually love the sentiment behind that. So maybe my life is just full of lots of little miracles, and maybe yours is too. But miracle or not, divine intervention or not, we should still say thank you. Praising God, being grateful, is not really an optional extra. The Bible commands us to praise the Lord. We need to learn from this thankful leper. Learn how to respond to God's blessings. We do need to fall in adoration. We need to spend time at his feet, being grateful, praising him for all our blessings, even when life doesn't feel good. Because that's where we are made well. That is where we are saved. Amen. We now stand to affirm our